Today I am going to present a paper around the topic of the new metrics of care, feminist perspectives on the crisis of reproductive labor. I want to open up saying that my general research interest is to explore the relationship between feminist theory and technology and see what is at stake in rethinking a feminist political theory of technology. The idea is to fill a gap both in the literature of media theory and feminist techno-science from the 80s onward by analyzing the socio-political ecological consequences of technological applications. In this respect, my argument is that feminist theories of care could help us to reinstall the need for materialism and labor within technologies that are often extremely abstract and opaque. One of the most important achievements of feminist technoscience and digital feminism has been to decenter human agency, acknowledging the natural cultural continuum. My idea is that those theories help us to rethink an onto-ethical alternative for our socio-technical world, but they do not explain enough the current pitfalls and flaws of the capitalist system. So, for example, how value is extracted from labor or aggregated through different operations. Feminist and Marxist theory of care, working towards broadening some concepts such as metrics, value, and care itself, can uncover the social dimension within the techno-social worlds and applications. Ultimately, my aim is still, and I'm here inspired by Paulo's conclusions as well, to work across the thin line that separates the catastrophic and pessimistic vision of technology and its emancipatory and utopian conception. Feminist theories, and often more in the field of media and cultural studies, have widely reflected on technological applications used for care, focusing especially on social robotics, data governance, and biases incorporated in machine vision. One question that we might ask ourselves is what could or should we do with models and metrics that are applied in data analytics, machine learning, and AI? What do we do with the computation, the structures of computation themselves? To explain my problem, I looked up at a particular example, examining a series of leading surveys of biomedical applications of AI on the management of the COVID-19 pandemic. From the point of view of public discourse, there has been a lot of focus on contact tracing because it represents the visible face of the use of data for public and private purposes. You see here the schema. The voluntary release of medical data contributes to the state management of the pandemic, but at the same time raises concerns towards the problem of privacy, given that data are used by third-party stakeholders. However, if we look at some of the applications of AI and machine learning on more complex issues, such as the use of some algorithmic models to study the reaction of the antigens in response to SARS-CoV-2 virus, and that is often based on support vector machines, this narrow framework further complicates the interpretation of what AI does for care, here conceived in the limited sense of public health care. Some of the challenges that biomedical researchers face right now is to demonstrate the effectiveness of the application of machine learning during the pandemic in the different fields of forecasting outbreaks, medical diagnostic, research on drugs and vaccine, and contact tracing. While research is blooming, they lament the need for more data collection to feed the machines, and at the same time, the necessity to prevent through state governance the issue related to data privacy. Only one of the surveys examined expressed concern toward the fairness and inclusiveness of an AI application, while another one underlines the need of expanding the use of AI in developing countries. In general, there is a dissemination of models and algorithms used in the management of the pandemic in the search of a possible optimization of some calculations that need a large amount of data. Whereas various algorithms instruct those machines, many of them use basic procedures such as logistics regression that can calculate the probability predictions among two binary options of 0 and 1, where 1 is a combination of nonlinear independent variables. From this point of view, even in its variety, the great field of machine and deep learning applied to medicine still relies on some basic statistical metrics. So that, for example, going back to our case of the SVM, we can notice that it's still based on formulas of optimization. So researchers are looking for the maximum value of a function at a lowered cost, or we can say also the shorter way to reach point A, starting from point B when there are several options. Now, I wanted to scratch the surface of the layers of problems one encounters in analyzing few applications of AI to the pandemic, because beyond the immediate issue of the contact tracing, which still maintains a relative amount of human agency in releasing data, further on, we encounter political issues that are related to the hyper-specialization needed to grasp the mechanism beyond AI and the overall opacity of its functioning that has been considered a real enigma. This poses a series of enormous political problems since we deal with complicated models, metrics, and instructions that are not accessible democratically if we define here democracy as self-management or mediated management of a series of processes. To put it concisely, one application of AI stimulates the same problem that post-industrial and global capitalism poses to us, since we cannot grasp, looking from above, the totality of its mechanisms and all its developments and consequences. Capitalism in its totality is not visible within a single frame, as well as the operations of AI are in their complexity invisible. And this is a question for a critical theory of capitalism that many scholars have posed in criticizing contemporary informational or logistical capitalism. I'm here obviously thinking of Jameson, Toscano and Kinkel, Mezzadra, Nilsson and Bianchi. So my questions are the following. How do we look at this problem from a feminist perspective or from a feminist theory point of view? And why we should look at those problems from the point of view of feminist theories of care? Now, I want to solve this question in this short intervention, but I will unpack a series of analysis, perspectives, tools, ways of addressing these problems that might indicate some possible directions. So ultimately, my question is, can we have some feminist or intersectional technologies of care, especially looking at the development of digital technologies? And what are the challenges in rethinking their metrics and their architectural models? So we should imagine the architecture of an AI model as an invisible architecture of a city, since it permeates our reality in such a deep way that even from the point of view of single user, its consequences might seem minimal, they are in fact significant. Similarly, we could conceive the metrics used by these models as parameters that regulate instructions, which might be simple, such as simple equation, or evolute such some algorithms. Thinking in terms of architecture could allow us to examine the connections of AI with human and other non-human ecologies. Whereas the largely used term surveillance, which describes one of the many and undeniable functions of AI capitalism, does not enlarge the vision beyond users' behavior and corporation system of predation. Surveillance capitalism, as we all know, became the leading term in the field of media theory since Shoshana Zuboff accurately explained the mechanism of extraction of data and exploitation of users for the sake of the economic cycle of profit. However, one of the shortcomings of her approach is to find a solution in the defense of data privacy or personal information, that even if it constitutes the necessary step towards the practice of refusal of the intrusiveness of surveillance capitalism control, does not solve the question of which city or architecture we want to live in. While according to Zuboff, reclaiming data privacy implies the following question: who knows, who decides, who decides, I would rather reformulate this problem beyond the dichotomy of market versus democracy toward the questions: who owns, who decides, how do we democratically control and decide over those architecture? This question related to the perspective has been strongly posed by feminist theories of care by exploring what are the possible alternative models to capitalist society based on care. Often they found solution in the form of sustainability and development of community and kinships. So my question here is, could we also think beyond those communities themselves, considering the amount of complexity and interconnectedness that computational capitalism proposes to us? In thinking through architecture, we should also avoid another approach, such as that of Benjamin Bratton, who, insisting on the concept of architecture, ends up reducing the socio-technical dimension to the eco-technical dimension of the stack. I'm here making a joint reference both to his major book and the last one for Verso, The Revenge of the Real. In his view, society is reduced to a mass of users, and any human counteraction which is not already part of a system of planning and governance is constantly useless. If the eco-technical mega machine in which we live in is a stack that contains multiple totalizing layers, in order to reimagine the system, we can only design another comprehensive and totalizing mega machine. So that, according to him, computational architectures are never exploitative or economically oriented, nor questioned from the point of view of social groups, unless we consider a generic claim for the inclusion of the entire biological system a viable way of rethinking and claiming for inclusion and for solving anti-environmental crisis. If we live in a socio-technical dimension, what is missing in those accounts, both Zuboff's and Bratton's, and where feminist theories of care could help in filling the gap, is precisely the relevance of the social dimension, which include a labor of care, its metrics, and possibly a rewriting of computational architectures. In particular, feminist and Marxist theories of care could challenge or implement our system of computation across three lines: the analysis of the political economy of those architectures, the metrics implied, and the possibility of commoning them, both making their ownership and their management organized through common usages and procedures. On the political economy of those architecture, one problem that might arise is how machine learning and deep learning procedures applied, for example, to the development of the vaccine, are put into the economic cycle of valorization once that we are looking at it from above, so from the federal investments in research to the production of the vaccine and its distribution to its final revenue. Gramscian anthropologist Kaushik Sunder Rajan describes as pharmocracy the intermingling between governance, global regulation, and market system of exchange when he analyzes the two controversial cases of the introduction of the HPV vaccine and the denial of a patent for an anti-cancer drug in India. According to him, pharmocracy is the global harmonization of clinical trials and intellectual property regimes that has been conceived in terms of, and I quote again, multinational corporate hegemony. As well as the race for clinical trials is differentiated across the world, currently the race for AI biomedical applications is spreading out, with the tendency of aggregating in corporate conglomerates management regulated by WTO agreement on trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. If for Sunder Rajan, the question of pharmacological value cannot be reduced to the economic measurement, since it also includes aspects of bioethical, constitutional, and even post-colonial values across competing visions, he applies a strong Marxian core to the analysis of the topic of value. And here we have the quote: Via Joseph Dumit, he argues that, and I quote, surplus health as an analogy to Marxian surplus labor, end quote, showing that the classic economic cycle of circulation, MC M prime applied to pharmaceutic, could be interpreted by considering M prime as including a variable that incorporates, and I'm quoting again, future illnesses of those who might one day consume drugs. Through his interdisciplinary analysis, Rajan sees a counteraction against the financialization of pharmaceutic in people-centered research. So now in this context, this idea of people-centered research might sound as a slogan, but in reality poses a series of questions for democracy, intellectual property, the role of expertise that are still relevant today, more than when the book came out in 2017. Another analogous approach to the question of value produced in the biomedical field can be found in the work of Cooper and Waldby, who have examined the question from below, looking at the labor of the subjects implied in the market of assisted reproduction and clinical trials. The idea is that in biopolitics itself, what is put at work is the life itself. Cooper and Waldby, examining clinical labor via Foucault and the studies of biopolitics, achieved the same results that Italian autonomist feminists from Dalla Costa to Federici reached when discussing the value of reproduction through the wages for housework. If the factory becomes the society itself, we can find productivity and value even in activities that do not produce value directly, such as housework, child rearing, preparing meals, and so on and so forth. In the work of regenerative labor, such as in producing stem cells or embryos, this value, according to Waldby and Cooper, is produced extracting it directly from bodies, so that from the factory, we not only reach the society, but also the embodiment itself of capitalist economics. Both Sunder, Rajan, and Cooper and Waldby suggest that by inserting technobiological innovations within the general economic cycle of valorization, which can help us to address the problem of the patents of invention, also in computation, both looking at the labor of a single user and looking from the point of view of aggregate capital through challenging its ownership and the development of global chains of research and profitability. The problem of the political economy of EI is strictly connected with another crucial topic in feminist theories of care, which is the problem of value and its metrics, both conceived in an economic and non-economic implications. Is there a way we could go beyond the productivist prediction patterning optimization schema? What rethinking of optimization, for example, would entail? Whereas I do not think that we can easily, to say the least, recreate other models or different algorithmic instructions without the involvement of biomedical or computational engineers, and this might open up a question of the involvement of humanities and social sciences within digital and computational sciences. One issue at stake is the metrics with which we define optimization beyond economic profitability. In 2006, Nancy Folbre worked on defining new ways of measuring care beyond the Gender Development Index that measure women's health and well-being, and gender empowerment measure that calculates gender equality among men and women. According to her, the introduction of these measures leaves unchallenged questions related to the activity of the care itself. So, for example, who care for the dependents and the time allocated in the household that might be still unequal towards men, even in a context of high GDI and GAEN. In defining new indexes, she challenges both the definition of care and the network of dependencies, including the disposable time of a caregiver. This multi-layered indexing of care challenges at the same time the definition of care itself by including in it a variety of activities. Folbre's work might be important because it pushes to the limit the theory of economics itself by discussing its metrics. We could even consider her work as a practical application of the autonomous Marxist feminism ideas of productivities and of traditionally unproductive areas and branches. The same endeavor might be applied to the metrics of healthcare involved in biomedical computing research by expanding the concept of healthcare itself and considering a series of social, racial, gender indexing, which often are left apart in the management of a disease or a pandemic. And secondly, integrating different visions of care. Now, when we are used to introduce this project that we host at Duke, Revaluing Care in the Global Economy, Jocelyn Olcott, I, and many other researchers define care according to Tronto and Fisher definition. And sorry, I don't have a slide about that, but the quote is this: as an activity that includes everything we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible. So according to us who are developing this project, those activities address a complex system in which social, cultural, and ecological care are often imbricated, so that it would not be possible to analyze, for example, economics without taking into account the ecological consequences and working toward different representations or embodiment of care. To apply this expanded vision toward metrics and definitions of computation might allow us to see the interdependency of technical, social, and ecological architectures, for example, evaluating the ecological impact of computing machines or social inclusiveness within their calculations. This challenge is also directed, following Folbre, toward the elaboration of new concepts. So the already well-developed field of EI ethics proposes to include themes such as fairness, transparency, privacy, accountability within computation. Could we invent better concepts that challenging metrics, ownership, and democracy of computation could lead us in designing different future? Could we even think of making computation common or commoning it? What this would imply? This is an open question, of course. While some interesting studies centered around data, such as the Ignatian plain data feminism, showed us some possible outcomes in exploring data settings through intersectional and feminist lens, Black feminist media studies researcher uncovered the implicit biases included in machine vision and posed the necessity of including justice in designing EI. Finally, Cathy O'Neill even goes implicitly further, making us questions: do we really need predpol policing algorithms? My open problem as a conclusion for this paper, and similarly to what Paolo was wondering, is could we use or intensify those interpretation, analysis, and proposals challenging the kernels of computation itself? This question would imply the collective assessment of which applications of computation would be useful or not for a caring economy. And we can also wonder what, in our view, caring economy could mean. The challenge of ownership of computational production of value, considering that this endeavor would be both a political undertaking as well as a technical one. Finally, this would entail an analysis of what would be the role of experts and social movements in this process, and how states who have clearly an ambivalent role in governing computation could make themselves worthwhile. Thank you very much for listening at me. I hope that, I keep it short.